ultimately it can come to a point where the production side of it is holding you down from putting your best message out there. So if you hit that wall, then that can be a great time to say, okay, what can I outsource so that then I can, grow the show, think more high level about the show.
So glad you're here. This is the Women Who podcast, and I'm Alison Fraser. My guest today is someone who helps podcasters get their own show out to the world and also helps many others to do that too. But before we get into that, I wanted to let you know that the price for the Women Who Podcast membership is increasing from Monday, January 15th. So if you've been on the fence about joining, then now is the time to take action, as it will never be this cheap again. There are tutorials, Q&As, and other resources, plus other women podcasters to cheer you on. The link to join is in the show notes. Back to our guest today. I'm so excited to bring in Lauren Wrighton, the host of the Podcast Manager Show, a weekly podcast where Lauren shares how to build a profitable podcast management business. How to build a profitable podcast management business without working more than 20 hours a week. I wanted to bring Lauren on because so many podcasters struggle with aspects of their show that they can outsource, but don't always know where to turn to for help. And I've also heard other podcasters say how much they love to edit and would like to add that to their business. As a connector, it comes naturally to me to want to match people up with these kinds of services and the people who can help them. So expect to hear more kinds of interviews like this. Let's hear from Lauren now. Lauren, I'm so excited to have you on so we can learn all about podcast management, your own podcast experience, and everything that podcasters should know about outsourcing, or even how they can outsource themselves to do the job. So thank you for being on the podcast today.
Yes, thank you so much, Alison.
Can we just cut straight to the point of what does a podcast manager do? I've had lots of people ask me when I said I'm interviewing a podcast manager. They're like, well, what can I do for podcasters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a good question. Really, it comes down to taking the load of the weekly tasks off of your plate. So podcast managers, primarily, they will edit the podcast, write show notes, upload the episode for you, create promotional graphics, videos maybe. And like I said, ultimately, they are maybe the last person to make sure everything gets done. So that you don't, as a podcaster, you don't have to think like, oh gosh, did I forget to do this? Did I forget to send the email to the guest? Did I just like all those little things that you want to do to have a really great podcast? They can be the last person to say, okay, everything's done. Now moving on to the next episode.
I guess a lot of people would think that podcasting is simply just doing what we are doing right now and having this conversation and recording it. But there are so many things behind the scenes before and afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. And I didn't even mention, guest management. So thinking of great guests to have, reaching out to them, getting them booked, the follow-up, like all of that. It's so nice to have someone else who's kind of helping coordinate those things. And a podcast manager can fill that role as well.
So your podcast is called the Podcast Manager Show, and you help people who are either already in that field or thinking about going into podcast management with everything they need to know. So how did you fall into podcast management yourself?
Yes, it's such a funny story. So it starts way back. I started in an MLM. So if anyone isn't familiar with that, multi-level marketing, specifically I was in Beachbody, which now has a completely different name. So I had kind of gotten bit by the entrepreneurial bug. And I was trying to figure out, okay, what do I want to do? And nothing was really working. So I took a break, and finally it got to me in 2016. My friend and I had been listening to podcasts for a couple of years, and we're like, let's start our own podcast. Why not? And we were in our 20s. So we're like, we've got so many fun things we want to talk about. And people want to listen to us. So why not? So we started a podcast. And once I got going, I was a new mom as well. So I thought, okay, I launched the show. I taught myself how to edit. I had no background in this. I have a science background, so this was just like make it happen, right? And I taught myself how to edit, and I thought, you know what? I really want to find a way to make money at home, and I really am enjoying the behind the scenes of the podcast. So surely someone is looking for a podcast editor. And by kind of a coincidence, I found out about the virtual assistant world. And podcast management is really the marriage of podcast editing with the virtual assistant world. So there's a whole world of podcast editors, right? That have gone to school and are incredible and produce high quality shows. And then there's podcast managers, which of course they can have that amazing skill of podcast editing, but it's really so much more. And that's how I kind of found my way into podcast management. And that was really end of 2018 that I started as a podcast manager.
What was the skill that you enjoyed yourself about podcasting?
It was probably editing at first. Yeah, I mean, I'm very much a high level thinker, and so I was surprised that I enjoyed the detailness of podcast editing, but I really, really do and did. And also working with clients who they have, they talk about all different sorts of things, just like listening to them every single week is so cool. It's like forced education about topics that you enjoy. So I think those two things is like learning from the actual shows paired with the editing.
And getting paid to do it too, paid to learn.
Exactly.
When did you realize that you could help other podcasters become podcast managers, or even people that aren't podcasters to take on this skill?
Yeah. So, like I said, I'd spent a couple of years kind of dabbling and trying to figure out my way before 2016, and I tried some digital products and nothing really went anywhere. So once I started as a freelancer and things were really working and I was making money and that felt so good, I didn't want to do a digital product. I was like, that hasn't worked for me in the past, so I don't want to do that. But within my virtual assistant network, I was having, a handful of women say like, "Hey, I see that you're doing podcast management. Like, what is this? This is so cool. Can you teach me how to do it?" And I was like, "No, I don't want to create a digital course. I don't want to create anything. I'm so focused on my client work. My business is growing, but I couldn't at the same time. I couldn't just keep telling them no. Like, hey, make me something. I want to learn from you." So it really was that I was really busy as a podcast manager, but I thought, okay, I can put together like a $50 course with a couple of videos for these people that want to learn, no pressure on myself. I stayed up until 1 a.m. a couple nights in a row, got all the content done, and put it up on a course, platform, and then sold it like that for, I want to say, about 9 months, where it was very low pressure on myself because I didn't want to go in it. I was like, I'll just do it a little bit.
And then it exploded, I guess, because you're no longer doing the podcast management as such, are you?
I am a little bit. So I have two very long-term clients that I'm still working with. And so there's that. And I do some kind of one-off projects depending on what it is, how they find me. But yes, for the most part, I am coaching other podcast managers.
How many podcasts can a person manage at any one time? I guess it's like how long's a piece of string, but in general, if someone were thinking of going into podcast management, what's a good number of podcasts to have?
Yeah, it really depends on how much you wanna work because most of the time, most of the people that kind of find me, they wanna work part-time hours. That's why they wanna be a freelancer is they wanna be able to balance their personal life with their work life. So, if you're thinking of part-time hours around 20 hours a week, you're looking at, like, 5 to 7 clients. A lot of my students that I talk to, they're like, "7's my max." 7 was my personal max when it was, like, 20, 25 hours. So then you can imagine double that if you're working 40 hours a week, because 'cause I've got, plenty of students that do this full time as well. But I guess really what it comes down to, if people are doing, like, the math in their head, it really takes about 3 to 5 hours a week for 1 client. And of course, it depends, like, it depends on what the rules are, but on average, 3 to 5 hours for 1 client. So, depending on how many hours you wanna spend doing this, you can do the math there.
3 to 5 hours. That sounds like the amount of time that the podcaster, if they don't have a podcast manager, is spending on their podcast. So there's quite a
Exactly.
reasonable time when you
Right.
add everything up.
Yeah, yeah. And also the podcaster, they might take longer, number 1, because 'cause they're only editing their show, like, we can get good and fast at doing certain things, and the podcaster also this is a big thing, and I'm sure if you are a podcaster yourself listening, you can relate, is that you sit on doing it. You don't want to, like, edit your own show. It's just, like, this weird thing about doing your own work is more difficult, and you're like, "I don't wanna listen to myself. I don't wanna listen to myself." So, it's harder to do your own work, and so there's that as well.
When should a podcaster look into hiring someone to help them with their show?
Mhm. I think that the answer here is the production getting in the way of you being a podcaster? So maybe it's before you even launch your show. You want to start with a podcast manager. That happens all the time. And that podcaster is thinking, I don't want to learn about podcasting. I just want to show up as the host. So I want everything else taken care of because then I can show up in my business in another way that's more fitting with their strengths. So there's that person. There's also someone who maybe they do wanna learn a lot in the beginning, and then they know, "Okay, once I kinda get the machine up and running, then I'll outsource it." But ultimately, it can come to a point where the production side of it is holding you down from growing the show, from putting your best message out there. So if you hit that wall, then that can be a great time to say, "Okay, what can I outsource so that then I can, you know, grow the show, think more high level about the show?"
So now we're in this space, you say we're wanting to grow the show and the production is getting too much because there are other things that we want to be doing to help grow our show. Where do we go to find someone who can help us? And how do we know that they are the right person for us?
Mhm. Yeah. One of the big things that I talk to my students about that they bring to the table is that they are the ideal listener of the show. Now, this isn't always the case, but that is the sweet spot because when the podcast manager is truly the ideal listener, then it's kind of like you have your audience in your back pocket. Your podcast manager can say, hey, I looked at your stats and also, I'm part of this community, right? I'm part of this wellness community. I'm part of this motherhood, whatever. And I think like, "Hey, what about this topic? What about, this length of episode?" So they can really speak a lot into that. Again, as a podcaster, you can be kinda stuck in, "Does anybody like this?" Like, "I'm just speaking into a mic," and so you kinda have an outside perspective say, "Hey, these episodes, they seem like they're getting a little too long. Let's shorten them up," or, just all those little insights that can really help fine tune the show to help it grow.
Yeah, I suppose there are podcast managers who just do, I know, as you're saying, wellness podcasts that have their
Mhm,
own niche. So it's like a podcaster has their own niche, and therefore, why shouldn't a podcast manager also have that niche?
mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Do you find that you have any podcast managers who have so many different things going on in their head that they have an eclectic range of guests?
Yeah, yes, they have yeah, I know lots of my students have a very like, they thought they were gonna have, like, all wellness coaches. That's kind of what they went out to create. But then they started, get landing clients, and they've got this cool eclectic bunch, but they've all kind of maybe have, like, a similar personality or, like, maybe their values are kind of the same. So there's a thread of similarity, but they could be talking about all different sorts of things.
Yeah. And I suppose that would keep the job really interesting.
Yes, yes.
What makes a good podcast manager?
That's good. So, it is actually a very creative role. As much as it kind of comes off as technical, like technical editing and the tech side of the podcast, it's very creative. So there's this cool balance of being able to have the consistent work each week where, okay, each week you are doing tasks 1 through 5. But the content that you're listening to is different each time. So if you thrive under that consistency, but also a little bit of that creative control with the show, then that's great. And again, there's also a level of like detailed, but then a big level thinking. So if you are really good at details, then you're going to shine in that part of podcast management. But then also podcast managers do a lot of strategy with their clients to grow the show. So if you really like the big idea thinking and can kind of see into the future and things like that, then you can really shine in that part of the role.
What if you are thinking about being a podcast manager, but you don't want to do a certain aspect of it? Like, I don't know, show notes, for example.
Mhm.
Are there podcast managers who do everything, or can they pick and choose what they want to do?
Yeah, they can pick and choose. So, editing and show notes are the first two things that most podcast managers themselves will start to outsource. So once or they just never do it. Like they never edit and they always have an editor in their back pocket. And there are also some teams that a podcast manager can find themselves on where there is a separate editor and then the podcast manager does everything else. And usually how that kind of evolves is the podcaster first found an editor, but then they realize, okay, this is helping, but this isn't doing a lot of the heavy lifting that I need. And so then they hire a podcast manager who does everything besides editing. So yes, if you are like, I know I'm not gonna like editing, you can have your own editor on your team. And if you are like, okay, I can write a little bit, so I'll start writing and use AI because that's a thing. But then eventually I'd love to have someone write for me, then that's also done.
What did you enjoy the most about doing your own podcast, the very first podcast that you started?
Okay, yeah, the very first podcast I started, that was about fitness and wellness, and kind of selfishly, the thing I liked most about it was that because I had a co-host who was my friend, her and I got together every single week to record, and that was so good for our friendship. I was also, like I said, a new mom, so just having that touch point with my friend each week was so good for me personally in that season. So I think just like the funness of just having a conversation, putting it out there, and learning about the podcast world was just priceless.
I think podcasting is great for new mums because I remember that I first started listening to podcasts in 2008, but it wasn't until I was a new mum myself that I really got into listening to podcasts. And I would always have one in while going for a walk with the buggy. Baby was asleep. I was just there doing my exercise.
Yeah,
It's
I agree.
perfect.
Yeah, it gives us an outlet. My favorite thing right now, my favorite piece of self-care, okay, it's kind of self-care and kind of not, it's like productive self-care, is listening to a podcast and folding laundry because I can go into my room by myself and listen to something that's either making me think or is funny, and I can fold laundry, and when I walk away, 30 minutes later, I'm like, "Okay, I was productive, but I also feel very refreshed." So, yeah, there's been different seasons of my motherhood where podcasting has helped me through.
What would 16-year-old Lauren say if you'd said, "Hey, Lauren, you're going to be talking to thousands of people a week in a
Yeah.
podcast"?
It's I mean, I would never expected it. I would never have expected it, but I also have I love speaking. So, like, I don't wanna say I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I would be shocked." Like, no, not quite shocked. Podcasting, yes, I would have been surprised because I have a degree in biology, so these are not related. But, I my vision for my life at that point was like, I wanna find a way where I can work, full time, whatever, like had this career, but also I always knew that I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. And so that's been really the drive for this role as a podcast manager is how can I make this work for me? How can I balance work? And I know this is the conversation of motherhood, right? And so that part I would be very pleased. Like, okay, I have found a way to do work and mom, and it fits for me.
Podcasting is just this whole industry. I don't even think any of us could have imagined that it could just be more than something in your ears that you listen to when,
Mhm.
yeah, it spawned all these people that are making a living from being involved with podcasting.
Yeah, it's crazy.
What do you enjoy listening to when you're doing your laundry? Say, what podcasts do you like to listen to?
Yes, I love to listen to comedy. So just there's one show in particular that I listen to for comedy. I listen to a pop news. It's a daily show. I don't listen to it daily, but it's kind of like news for a millennial. And then there's another show that I listen to that is history. So I kind of dabble. And then, of course, I listen to business. I don't listen to as much business anymore just because I'm like, I don't need more ideas. I need to tame my idea machine. So when it comes to business advice, I usually go more of the ebook route, still listening, but it's a little bit more focused, of a listening experience. So yeah, history and pop culture, not really pop culture, but pop news and comedy.
It was a good tip, though, you just gave about not listening to too many business podcasts, because I think you can hear so many different ideas from people that you kind of get lost and have no idea what you should be doing. So choose one podcast and just do what they do.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally.
And if it's podcast management that you're interested in, then the Podcast Manager Show would be the one to go to.
Yes.
Tell us about that podcast and when you decided to start that one.
Yes. So I launched my course in the beginning of 2019. And like I said, it took me really 9 months to start saying, okay, it's still going. It's somehow people are buying it, no, even though I'm almost hiding it from people. There was no marketing mechanism around it or anything. So at that point, the end of 2019, I was like, you know what? I think I might start exploring this, taking this serious. And it was, very good timing because only a couple months later, COVID happened. Lots of people came into the freelancing space. So I ended up launching my current show in July of 2020 after I kind of had, I redid my course, revamped it, and then was like, okay, let's put a podcast around it to market it and to teach people for free, how to start as a podcast manager.
That was really good timing.
Yeah, yeah. And I also left my first show in the beginning of 2019. So I really went like a year and a half without being a podcaster, but now I've been back in it for a couple of years.
What do you enjoy yourself about the whole podcast experience?
Probably how easy it is. When you get into a groove, you really can just get into a groove. Like I, of course, have my own podcast manager because like we talked about earlier, I cannot produce my own stuff. Like I will sit on it for as long as possible. I probably wouldn't even put it out on time because I don't want to listen to myself. And since 2019, I've had 2 babies. So even going through those changes in my life and taking maternity leave, like I've always kept my show up because once you can get into a groove, you can batch record. And easy is probably not like the most correct term. A lot of us are like, podcasting is not easy, but you really can get into a great groove. So I've been able to maintain it because of that and like, scale it a little bit down, scale it a little bit up when my business has needed it.
Have you made any massive mistakes in your own podcast that that you can share with us?
That is such a good question. I I don't want to say I have not made any mistakes, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. I I have never made the mistake of not hitting record, so I'm thankful for that. I have I've kind of gotten into interviews where I realize, okay, yeah, this is the one that I would probably say. Early on in this podcast manager show journey, I had some people on that I realized like they're not exactly talking to my person. My person is a podcast manager. It's a freelancer. They're not a podcaster. They might be a podcaster, but they don't identify as a podcaster. They identify as a podcast manager. And like sometimes it's simple, but like sometimes that's not computing for people. So because of that early on, I make sure it's so clear if someone comes on my show, we're talking to freelancers. We are not talking to podcasters. If you want to talk about the audience, you have to say your client's audience, not your audience. Like just those little details, they matter to me. And so I'd probably say that was like a mistake of not being super clear early on.
That's quite a good tip, actually, making sure that the guests you're having on to your show are who your audience wants to hear from. And
Hmm.
so with my show, Women Who Podcast, it kind of speaks as to who I'm having on. They are women who are podcasters and going to have more women on who speak about how to grow your own podcast or how to run your podcast. But again, they all have to be women and
Hmm.
predominantly have their own podcast too, because
Hmm.
I think when you're in the trenches, you fully understand what the audience is going through too.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had some yeah, if you have someone on your show who doesn't really get podcasting, but they have an expertise that makes sense, you kinda have to fill in the gaps sometimes with them. I'm like, "Okay," I like, maybe someone I have on my show talks about social media management. So there's some crossover with what we do and with what they do, but there's differences at the same time. And when you know who you're talking to, when you know who your audience is, it's your obligation to say, "Okay, this is how it's gonna work for us." Okay, that's
Mm.
not really the case for us, but this is, kinda making those connections.
And that's where all your editing skills come in, or your
Yes.
own manager's editing skills for your podcast.
Yeah, totally.
You mentioned earlier about batch recording. So I like to batch record. Well, I don't really batch record, but I like to batch other tasks together. So I'm doing the same thing for
Mm.
a certain amount of time. Is that what you like to do too and recommend to your podcast management students?
Mhm. I th So, personally, as the podcaster, since I'm not doing the production tasks for myself, I don't batch record, as in, like, record more than one episode in one day, but I do try to we are always at least 2 weeks ahead, so there's that. But, right now when we're recording this, we're going into December, holiday month. And so I'm gonna get everything done for the end of the year so that we have less to do at the end of the month. So I will batch record so that I can have a couple weeks off from recording. So that's kind of how I am doing it right now. From the podcast manager perspective, we find different ways to make it work for a client because it's kind of a thing where you have to work with the client on what you can batch ahead of time. But, of course, podcast managers go on vacation. They go on maternity leave. They do those things, and so that comes in handy when it comes to wanting to take time off. And then I think the most powerful thing, though, for podcast managers is having a specific day of the week where they're working on a client. That's what I hear about the most is like, okay, Mondays, I always work on client A, Tuesdays, client B, because it helps them keep everything very straight and they can go into the zone for that client, get into the voice of that client, get it done, and then move on to the next client.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense too.
Mhm.
That you're going to work for one person at each time
Mhm.
rather than clients A through to E doing all their show notes and then having to change that voice in your head when you're trying to do the
Yeah.
writing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's good to hear that podcast managers get to work on their own schedule so they can also take a holiday.
Mhm. Of course, because we can only, grind and hustle for so long. Or maybe never, right? So, yeah, you definitely deserve a vacation. Definitely deserve some time off, and a lot of the reason that, people are attracted to the freelance industry, freelancing in general, is for the flexibility. So, even though, you can get in kind of the 9 to 5 mindset where you're like, "No, I always have to work," you can fight against that and say, "Okay, no, I'm taking this time off," or, "I'm only working Monday through Wednesday," or whatever. It's different for everyone.
Are there certain platforms that your managers all like to use for editing and for show notes? Like, and if there are, can you share them with us?
Yeah, no, we're all over the map, but some of the favorites for editing are Audacity. So, Audacity is free. It's got a lot of capabilities, but it's very good for the beginner. And then there's the other favorite is Adobe Audition, which it has so many capabilities. And most of the time when podcast managers start using that one, it's because they got into a role where the client wants them to use that. So they may be working for a podcast agency or so they're working for someone who's like, "Hey, we do all of our editing in this." So then they learn how to do that, and it's kind of a nice thing to have in their back pocket. And then the third one, as far as editing goes, is Hindenburg. That's another one that if someone gets into it, they usually love it, but because I teach Audacity, most of my students use Audacity and love it.
Yeah. I actually used a script, which is a completely
Mhm.
different one, but I do like
Yeah.
Audacity because the sound waves, and you can pick the smallest thing to take out, can be very precise with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of those tips so far, Lauren. I would like to just know from yourself, what you have learned from podcasting that you would like to share with other podcasters. What is your top tip?
Mm, my top tip is I believe that podcasts do really well because they connect with an audience. So if you have the mindset of like, hey, I'll just hit record and talk about my life and talk about my thoughts and you're not connecting with someone, it's not going to go anywhere. So you really want to, even if you have 2 downloads, 10 downloads, 20 downloads, you want to figure out why are those people listening to you? What is it about your message that is connecting with people so that you can craft a show that serves you and serves your business, but also connects with people? Because yeah, the audience is everything. If they're not there, it's not it's not really a podcast anymore. It's just like a diary. So, back from whenever my friend and I started that fitness podcast years ago, we went through that. We had to figure out why aren't people listening to these episodes? Well, people didn't care so much about those topics or whatever. So, really connecting with your audience and figuring out what they like, what connects with them, and experimenting, frankly, is my number one tip.
That's a really good tip. It's a shame we can't see on our podcast app who our listeners are so we can ask them, hey, why do you listen
Right.
to our show?
Yes, you have to be creative to get them, to find out who they are and to connect with them and ask them questions and not be like interrogating them at the same time.
Yeah. And what's your biggest cringe when you hear a podcast? Like, what makes you think, oh, I wish they had done this to their show?
Yeah. Probably probably when someone is repurposing audio from somewhere else, like a Facebook Live or a coaching call or whatever. They're repurposing something onto their show and they leave in things that don't need to be left in. And I don't mean like to the minute detail. Like, we get it. That's fine. If you say like click below because that's fine. But, 5 seconds of just dead space. Oh, and then you saying like, hey, just clean it up a little bit in the beginning and the end, and I'm happy. But when that's not done and I have to wait for dead space to go by, I'm getting a little antsy.
Yeah. Oh no, it's a good tip. Don't have any dead space in.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, this has been so much fun, Lauren. Can you please tell us where we can find all your things? I will put the links in the show notes, but I want to make sure that anyone who is interested in learning more about managing other people's podcasts can find out where to find you.
Yes, thank you so much. So, we've mentioned my podcast, the Podcast Manager Show. You can find that everywhere. I'm also on Instagram at Lauren Wrighton. And then I have a free class where you can learn how to become a podcast manager, work 20 hours a week. In that masterclass, you can find at laurenwrighton.com/masterclass.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been a heap of fun. So thanks for coming on.
Yes, thank you so much, Allison.
Thanks again, Lauren, for the conversation. One thing we didn't touch on was the money side, and Lauren talks about this in her masterclass and how podcast managers can bring in around 5,000 US a month working part-time hours. Of course, the length of episode and frequency will have some influence over what you will pay or can earn. Links to Lauren and her masterclass are in the show notes, as well as the link to the Women Who Podcast membership, which, as I mentioned before, is increasing from January 15th. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back soon. You've been listening to Women Who Podcast, the podcast for women with something to say.